Welcome to DevCon 2013. We ready to get going? All right. And that concludes my presentation. Okay, just a couple quick minutes to introduce myself before I get into the fun stuff. My name is Cris Ippolite. I am the founder and president of a company called iSolutions, based out of Los Angeles and Chicago. We're an FBA authorized trainer, platinum member, blah, 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 blah. A couple things I wanted to point out to you, though, about this session that are important. First of all, I'm the FileMaker trainer on lynda.com, and I do have a video that's on there about using HTML5 and FileMaker together. And there's some little free passes sitting on those chairs if you guys want to go check that out. Nice little video on there. The other thing is, though, too, this URL that I highlighted in red up on the screen, FileMakerHTML5.com, while I'm still allowed to use it before the folks at FileMaker Inc. Press issue with me on using their name in my URL. It's a blog that I've been putting together, and over the last year or so, I've been documenting all of the demos that I'm going to be showing you here today. So you can sit back and relax this morning and just kind of soak it all in. And if you want to get more information on it, I've got, a couple hours worth of instructional video and screencasts and code and free stuff and everything on that website. So definitely go check that out. So that's me. Curious about you guys. Just have a quick question while you guys are getting all settled, or a couple quick questions. How many of you guys are FileMaker certified? Excellent. It has nothing to do with my presentation. I'm just curious. Congratulations. I actually hold that in very high regard. Good job. Now, regarding the actual session, how many of you have some experience with HTML5 or JavaScript or cascading style sheets? Well, you guys put your hands down. The rest of you, come find me. We need to talk. This is a very exciting area in the FileMaker world. Let's talk about what this is first. But actually, before we get started, let me give you a little teaser of what we're going to be covering here today. So if you look up on the screens, what I've done is put together a little montage of all the different demonstrations that I'm going to be showing you here this morning. All these things we're going to get to. I'm really excited about all this stuff. And what you're actually seeing here on screen are FileMaker layouts. So all sorts of extended functionality right inside your FileMaker layouts, stuff that you can't do natively with the tools that we have already. And I'm going to show you how to do this. And guess what? You don't need any plugins or web servers or any licensing costs or anything like that. It's all free. And believe it or not, it's actually kind of easy. That's what I'm here to tell you guys about, that you don't need to know JavaScript or CSS or HTML, although the folks that raised their hands a moment ago certainly have an advantage in this. But what you do need to know how to do is to work inside FileMaker, like create FileMaker calculations. You guys probably have a comfort level there. And show of hands, how many of you know how to copy and paste? Okay, good. That's on the certification test. So today I'm going to talk to you about what HTML5 is. We're going to cover that to kind of demystify that a little bit, and why developers like us should care about this. And then I'm actually going to teach you some of the basics behind integrating HTML into your own FileMaker layouts, and also talk to you a little bit about cascading style sheets and JavaScript and knowing a little bit about that stuff as well. And some important concepts I'm going to introduce you to, like the concept of a data URL or even an FMP URL. Sounds like a lot of alphabet soup so far, but I promise you it's pretty cool stuff, and at the very least, those will be interesting takeaways for you. I'm going to show you how to use the FileMaker's calculation engine to actually generate HTML that can be read by the web viewer. And then talk about how scripts can, web viewers can actually execute scripts within your FileMaker databases. And all of this is going to allow you to create eye-catching interfaces like the ones you're seeing on screen right inside your FileMaker layouts. So my goal here is to allow you guys to kind of think about different ways to visualize your own FileMaker data and use your imaginations a little bit here. And most importantly, I'm here today to hopefully inspire all of you to use your own imagination and take your FileMaker databases to places you would never thought you could before. So let's have some fun with this morning. I've been working on this technique for a couple years now, and I'm actually just super, super excited to be here this morning to talk to you guys about it. And I hope to share that enthusiasm with you. So a couple of quick things. I got about 85 minutes of material to fit into 75 minutes. Apologies, no shocker there. The conference staff has asked us to make sure that folks keep questions at the end, and I promise you guys, I'll stand out in the hallway for 5 hours if you need to address all your questions. I just want to make sure to get everything in here today, because I got a lot of fun stuff to show you. And by the way, everything I'm showing you can be found in the updated conference materials. So if you go to the conference website, you can see my updated slides, which I have updated since June. And if you go to the FileMakerHTML5.com, you're going to see everything that I'm talking about. Again, much more exploded detail on a lot of the concepts and demos I'm going to discuss. And I even have a surprise for you guys if you stick it out to the end. Not trying to bribe you or anything. But really what I want you to do is just kind of sit back, relax, check out what's going on screen, and kind of have some fun here this morning. All right? So you guys ready to get started? Let's do this. All right. So first of all, let's talk, before we get into all the fancy stuff, let's talk about what HTML5 actually is. So HTML5, well, first of all, if you talk about the spec of HTML5, well, actually, what's HTML4 and what's the number mean? Well, HTML is a tag language or a text-based language that we're all familiar with. We've interacted with it if we've been on the web, because what it is a language that we use to instruct browsers on how to display all sorts of information. And we've been working with this all, of course, as part of the internet culture for some time. Now, by the official spec, this HTML5 is an enhanced version of the HTML language that we're all used to, and it includes some additional features in the form of these tags. That's a language that we're using inside HTML. And some of the new tags are things like better video handling and audio handling. You see those on the left-hand side of your screen there. And there's some cool stuff that's going on inside HTML5. As a matter of fact, and in addition, it's not just the tag language itself, but it's the browser support for this new emerging standard, okay? And the good news is the browsers that we care about in FileMaker, when we're using web viewers, do have support for HTML5, okay? So that's why it's time for us to get excited about this. And I'm sure you guys are already pretty excited about HTML5 after what you saw last night, right? Yeah. Pretty cool stuff. So what's interesting about what we saw last night, which, by the way, awesome, mind blown, very excited about that, right? And I'm going to show you some other stuff that uses the same technology here too today. So the interesting thing about when you see something that's HTML5 or when someone's talking about something that's HTML5, what they're actually really talking about is a combination of different technologies. For example, I can show you something here. There's this website I urge you all to check out. It's apple.com/HTML5. And what it is, it's their HTML5 Showcase, right? So they want to really show the power of the HTML5 language and its browser support inside of Safari in particular. And there's 7 different demos there, and when you get some time, of course, not right now, you can go on the website and poke through all those, and there's some code that you can download, and it's kind of cool. But what's interesting is, out of these 7 demos, only 2 of them are actually just HTML5. The other ones are a combination of technologies, HTML5, JavaScript, and cascading style sheets. So really what I'm here to tell you is that when most people are talking about these technologies all put together, or when you're looking at something that is HTML5, it's really a combination of HTML5 with embedded JavaScript and cascading style sheets, okay? So I'm going to talk about all those technologies here this morning. So what I've done is I put together a FileMaker file to really I'm going to start off real slow with this concept here. So there's 2 things I'm going to talk to you guys about. I want to show you what HTML, HTML5, JavaScript, and CSS really are. I'm going to show you some examples of those. But I'm going to show you these in the context of FileMaker layouts. So everything I'm going to show you here today is all these languages being interpreted by a web viewer in your FileMaker layouts. Because what I want to impress upon you guys here today is that you can use these technologies to enhance your FileMaker layouts and the way that you visualize your data, and do it in some pretty sweet ways. I promise you that much. Okay, so let's just start off real easy. So what we're looking at on screen here is just a FileMaker layout. I've got a field on it. Over here, this is just a text field. And over here, this is a web viewer. And the web viewer is simply pointing to the field that you see on the screen. Okay, so the concept here is I'm going to actually type some HTML into a text field, and the web viewer is going to interpret it for me. That's really the crux behind this technique that I want to share with you guys here this morning. So let's try it out. Okay, so now I've got some HTML, and for those of you that are familiar with HTML, this is about the simplest HTML you can get, right? Some opening tags, open up the body, and then I type in some text that says hello world. But interestingly enough, the web viewer is not interpreting this and showing the text. Now the web viewer natively is intended to act like a web browser and point to a web server that has an HTML document on it, and then interpret the instructions within that HTML document. But the technique that I'm showing you guys here today, my favorite part about it is you don't even have to be connected to the web to make these things work. And the intention behind that is that what I want to do is to be able to have you guys walk around using this technique in your layouts on an iPad that might not even be connected to the internet, right? So the trick here, the first little cool takeaway I'm going to show you here this morning is that I can add one little piece of text and it's like turning a switch on in my web viewer and telling it, well, we don't need a web server anymore. FileMaker is going to generate the HTML. And that little switch is just adding this text right here. This is called the data URL. Oh yeah, write all that down. It's on the test. Well, not really, but you know. All you do is you add data : text / HTML and then a comma. And as you'll see in every one of the demonstrations I'm showing you here today, if you add that as a prefix to the code inside either your text field or your calculations that are generating the HTML, FileMaker doesn't need to be connected to the web. It can just go read the output of this field. All right, does that make sense? So data URLs, that's the first takeaway that I wanted to impart upon you guys here. So let's take this a little step further. Instead of just having some raw HTML, now I've got the same thing going on here. Web viewer, simply pointing to this field. Now inside the field, you still see I've got that HTML in here, but in the blue I've added some additional text. Okay, and don't worry too much about this because a lot of the technique that I'm showing you here today involves just copying and pasting this stuff into a field. So again, if you can do that, don't sweat it. But just as sort of a point of interest, I wanted to show you how I can continue to embellish the text that I've just simply put inside of a FileMaker field, and the web viewer interprets it in a different way. What the web viewer is doing actually right now is it's reading this stuff in blue. This is what's called CSS, or cascading style sheets. It's just additional information that I embed within my HTML that the browser, or in this case the web viewer, can interpret in pretty interesting ways. So now instead of just having a piece of text, what I've got is a box, and that box has some color coding on it, and it even has some text inside of it, right? So we can see that by just manipulating HTML code, we can have more interesting things, I should say. Trust me, we're going to get a lot more interesting than just this little box floating around. But we can do things. We can manipulate things that are happening inside of a web viewer. And if the users don't care that we have a web viewer, by the way. This is just stuff that's happening on our layouts. All right, so this is an example of HTML with some CSS integrated. And of course, I'm using that data URL. You're going to see this in every example. Let's take this a step further. Now what I've done inside the web viewer is I've just used some HTML and a little bit of CSS just to position where this goes. But what I've done now is I'm integrating an image into the web viewer. All right, and for those of you that know HTML, you're probably familiar with this image tag here, right? And you open up a tag and do image src and you point to the source of the image. Now there's something kind of cool going on here. This is my second fun, cool thing that I wanted to show you guys this morning. This isn't just a regular URL. I told you before, this technique doesn't require web servers, right? Well, it requires a FileMaker server in this particular case. What's going on here is I'm pointing to a URL, and I'll show you this in a second. Well, I got a slide here. I'll show you. What I'm using is this neat thing that's actually been around in FileMaker well before FileMaker 12. This is a URL, and a URL is just a string of information that you put inside a web browser, and then something shows up in your browser for all practical purposes. This URL is particularly interesting because it's an old XML URL that points to a FileMaker database that's hosted on FileMaker server, and that image that we're actually seeing in the web viewer is an image that's stored in a container field. So we don't need to have a web server with a little images directory. We can just put images in container fields, which I'm sure most of your databases already have. As FileMaker, people are already choosing that as a way to store these images, right? So it's a way to display something that's stored in a container field, an image that's stored in a container field, but inside of our HTML. Now I know what you're thinking. I can also do that with a container field, right? But the idea is if we want to incorporate images, or even video for that matter, or audio, or different things that might be compelling inside of our HTML, we can do that using this URL. So we don't have to do the standard URL where we're pointing to a web server. So what might be something interesting that we could do? Well, here's an example. I'm further embellishing this code now, okay? And again, don't worry about it if the code that you're seeing is a little bit over your head. I promise you I'm getting to the copy and paste thing. I promise you. But what's interesting about what I'm doing inside this field is I'm adding more text to it. And in this case, what this text is allowing me to do is not only show two images inside the web viewer, which again, we can do in a container field, but It's allowing me to interact with these images, move them around on screen. One of my favorite terms in the tech world, drag and drop things around, right? Now we're really doing stuff inside FileMaker layouts that we can't do with our native tools. Just because we can't do it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense that we want it or that our business case actually means that we might need something like this, right? Plus it's fancy, right? So the way that I'm able to move that around is now I've added some additional text to the field. This is actually what the text looks like. Brace yourselves. This is JavaScript code, okay? Now, just to take a moment to describe what JavaScript code is, unlike the programming environments that we're all used to in FileMaker, JavaScript is just a big, long text document. And you can create functions in there, like custom functions. You build scripts in there, like the scripts that we're used to, script steps, all sorts of stuff. You can build an entire application's functionality all into one field, or one file, I'm sorry. So what I'm really just demonstrating here is I happen to go out into the world. Well, here's the best part about JavaScript, by the way, is that there are literally thousands of resources out there on the web that will just give you their JavaScript for free. That's my favorite part, right? No licensing code, no plugins, no cost, nothing, basically. That's where your copying and pasting really comes into play. So we went out into the web and we found this particular JavaScript library, and it's called Kinetic, and we read a little bit about it, and it says I can move things around on screen, basically. So we incorporated this into the web viewer. And again, no tricks up my sleeve. All this, actually, let me turn this off. So you can see all I'm doing, typing the text into that field, and I'm pointing the web viewer at the field right now, right? Just for this demonstration. And it allows me to move this around on screen. Let's take this to one more level, all right? So in review, FileMaker can generate HTML, and FileMaker's web viewer can interpret it and display it. So we're just talking about building all the logic still into FileMaker. We're not reaching out to any other web servers or anything like that to do this. But here's where things get kind of interesting. Let me put on my script debugger for a second. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go interact with this guy, and I'm going to drag him, and I'm going to drop him, and I'm going to release it. And what just happened? A FileMaker script just ran, right? So we're all familiar with script triggers inside of FileMaker. We've got file level script triggers, object level script triggers, and layout level script triggers. Now this is a whole other type of a script trigger that we can build inside of actions or user interaction inside of our web viewer. And what's cool about this is now, granted, you don't need to know anything about the JavaScript or anything like that to be able to manage this, but you guys all are comfortable building FileMaker scripts, right? So what's cool is I can say, well, I built all this to pop something up, and all I'm doing in this case is I'm actually just popping up a custom dialog. I'll show you what that looks like. And by the way, something else is happening too. What else is going on there besides just that script being run? Actually passing parameters to it. And if you look, those are single $sign parameters, which they're not global. So what that means is they only live for the life of the script. So what's actually happening is the web viewer itself is generating some data and passing it back to the FileMaker database. And the FileMaker script is unpackaging the data and doing something with it. So what does this mean in English, Chris? Well, what this means is inside of our web viewers or inside of our layouts, because again, our users don't need to know there's even a layout in the mix, right? What's actually happening is that we're generating HTML that gets interpreted and is displayed to the user. And even inside that HTML, we can then gather data or information and pass that back to the FileMaker database so it can unpackage it and interpret it, meaning we have a round-trip communication between the web viewer and the database, which is essentially the same thing that's going on in all our other FileMaker layouts. This just happens to be in the form of running a script. So let's explore how that script, well, there we go. If I play it, you'll see this pops up. So what's happening down on the bottom of this code, and again, I know it's a little early for this much code, but just a little secret that's happening here. Inside of JavaScript, what you can do in JavaScript is author your own functions. Just like we do with custom functions inside the FileMaker environment, you can do this inside of JavaScript. And what this function is doing in the least technical way possible that I can describe it is that it's saying when a certain thing happens, and by the way, we're used to all the actions that can trigger scripts and FileMaker layouts. Well, JavaScript has a whole ton more. They have ones like on release of something or on mouse over or when two things intersect and all that kind of really interesting things that you can do. Well, in this case, we've defined something to say when I pass the man over the chair and release the image, do something. And the something that I'm doing is this little, in our language, it would be a script step. So window.location in JavaScript means what we all know in FileMaker world as open URL. All right? So basically, when I release the one image on top of the other, open a URL, and then this is where this is my third kind of cool, fun thing here. The URL that actually runs is this one. So what's different about this URL is that it's not the HTTP or the HTTPS or the FTP URLs that we're all used to seeing. What's going on with this one? FMP URL. So FileMaker has its own URL. It's called a URL scheme. Let me just pause for a moment and talk about that. So this is a syntax of a URL that allows us to communicate with FileMaker databases. Okay, so how many of you ever used the feature, and even before 12, where you go under the file menu and you say send a link to this database, and you can send an email to somebody, and when they click on it, it opens up a FileMaker database? Don't worry, Rick, everyone's raising their hand. Well, what that is an FMP URL. As a matter of fact, I should probably show you an example of that. So that's this little feature here. You go send link to database. And I don't have a mail program set up here, so what it's going to do is show me this link that gets sent. So see how it's a FMP URL? I'm sorry, FMP : / da da da. So what it's doing is it's saying at this IP address there's a FileMaker server and it's hosting this file. Go there and tell the server to open up the file. And this has been around for how many versions? A few. That's the thank you, Rick. So it's been there for a few versions. But in 12, this feature got greatly enhanced. So first of all, it's kind of cool that we can, from some external place, we can actually instruct FileMaker to open up a file. That's kind of cool on its own, right? In this case, I'm having the web viewer do something. But in FileMaker 12, FMP URLs have been further enhanced. So not only can we open up a file, so you see in the blue on the bottom, this is the actual FMP URL that I'm running inside the demo that I just showed you. I go to that IP address, 127 blah, 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 blah. I find a file that's called steps, okay? And then I can run a script. So that's what FileMaker 12 has now allowed us to do. We can communicate with the FileMaker database and also run a script in there. And then even beyond that, I can set variables and pass data to that FileMaker database. This is crazy exciting stuff. Well, you know, I'm excited about it. And we can pass all sorts of set all sorts of variables, pass all sorts of stuff. So all the demos that I'm going to show you here this morning are the web viewer doing a bunch of stuff, compiling a bunch of data, building what I call data arrays, and then passing that back to the FileMaker database to go do stuff with. It's all happening behind the scenes. The users don't even know that what they're doing is compiling or changing data, and then we're passing it back to the database to do something with it. It's pretty cool stuff. The other thing that's interesting too about FMP URLs is that I can also pass a script parameter. So earlier I described this technique as being able to, this is another kind of a script trigger, right? Well, all the other script triggers we can set a parameter, which means we can say something like, when I ran this script, it was on this layout or something, right? So I can run, I can have a script that I can run from inside my FileMaker layouts and say, oh yeah, I ran this one from inside the FileMaker layout. And I can pass a parameter, for example, that would say, well, this one I ran from inside the web viewer. So I can identify from where this script is being triggered, and I can run a script, and I can send the script data. That all we have to do on the script side is just do the, we just basically reference the $ variable name that we defined in the URL, and we have all that data available to us. So it's kind of interesting, right? Now the only caveat to this is the file does need to be hosted on FileMaker server, right? Because the URL has an IP address in it, and we're telling it where it can find that. Now there's a really cool, compelling way that you don't have to have a file hosted on server to be able to use an FMP URL, and that's if the file is on FileMaker Go. If it's on FileMaker Go, it can talk to itself. It can send scripts to itself even though it's not hosted. And in that case, what you do, see the second line there where there's a $ instead of the IP address? That's the trick. That's how you can, technically what's happening there is you can talk to a FileMaker file that's on Go that's already open. Or if you're sending a script back to the same database, of course it's already open because you're sending a script from within it. Or you can also send a script to another file that's on FileMaker Go that's not open at the time, and that's where you use that little tilde one that's on the bottom. Pretty interesting, right? FMP URLs, this is cool stuff. One of my favorite things about FileMaker 12. Oh, there's a ton of them though, Rick. I love FileMaker 12. Okay, so now I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, this is all fine and good, but there's no way that I'm going to be able to convince Sally from accounting to just type HTML code and JavaScript into a bunch of fields so stuff can happen in my web viewer, right? Well, I'm not actually saying to do that. Just for the sake of this example, let's look at this in a different way. So here what we're actually doing is I've broken up the fields now, okay? Instead of one big long HTML, what I did is I broke it up right where the text part is. And just to show you what's going on in the background, now what I'm doing, and by the way, this is one of my favorite things about the web viewer. To me, tell them I'm busy. One of my favorite things is that this is actually a calculation, okay? In my world, I think of a web viewer as a calculation that displays in a web page or displays in something that a browser can read. So we have calculations that can display as text, display the result as text, display the result as containers, numbers, whatever. This is one that displays its result as essentially HTML that can be interpreted by a browser. And it's unstored, which means all the values that I'm putting in here, it's constantly monitoring to see if those have updated. And when they do, it goes and updates, in our case, the HTML. All right, so let me show you an example of that. I've concatenated these three fields together. And what I'm really suggesting here is that what you would do is only reveal the one in yellow to your users. So let's say it just happens that my business rule is I want a piece of text to show up in this thing. So what I would do is I would have this field and I would say, and see how it updated the text over in the web viewer? Oh, that's great. I'm trying to say something nice to my lovely fiance in the back row and she's not even looking. Anyway, so, so here we go. Oh, so much for rehearsal. But let me show you a more compelling example of this. This would be another one. So this is this is the same HTML where I had the CSS in there. And if we look really close, actually, what we've got are inside the CSS, I would say, I want it to be the distance from the top is, and then after that comes a number. So what I did is I broke that HTML code up, and now I have another user field with the number in it. So let's look at what that allows us to do. I can allow the users to manipulate what's happening on screen by just updating this information, right? And I can have them change the color or even the text inside this object. This is very rudimentary. Again, I'm not suggesting you're going to have a FileMaker database where you got to draw a box with colors in it, right? I'm just sort of keeping it simple here because what you can do with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS is really anything. Like the sky is literally the limit on this. So here's another example of the same thing. So again, I'm using the web viewer's calculation engine on the back end, and I'm concatenating all these fields together, and I was careful about where I was breaking up the HTML and where I was putting the user fields. So the ones in yellow would be stuff that I would reveal to the users. And here again, I can move the position on screen around. But this part I like. I'm using that little URL, that container URL technique, and just a value list that's based on some record IDs. So I can pick which record I want to show. And for shameless promotion, I can even choose the size. Oops. And as I'm changing these things, the HTML is updating, right? And that's because essentially the web viewer is an unstored calculation. That's just waiting for things to change, and when it does, it redraws it. Pretty cool, right? Same thing here. And by the way, let me just pause for a moment. The coolest part about this is that I'm not even, on all the demos I'm showing you, I'm not even talking about users typing into fields and affecting HTML. I'm talking about field values being updated by things like other calculations updating, or relationships where more related records have now been added by other users in your system, and therefore the data you're referencing updates. All this kind of stuff is happening rapidly. I'm going to show you a demo in about a minute here. where I've got some stuff going on screen, and I could just let it sit there on my desktop, and as all the worker bees are changing things throughout the day, all these things will update without me having to hit any refresh buttons. Pretty cool stuff, right? So one other quick sort of example of this. Here, where I'm talking about that JavaScript, what I did is I created a calculation, and all I'm doing in the middle of it is I'm referencing a field that all I've done is I've copied and pasted all the JavaScript into this field, okay? And so that way I don't have to worry about putting it into my calculation or escaping it, you know, with the quotes and all that kind of stuff. I literally just take the entire JavaScript, copy it, paste it into a field in my database, and then I can just reference that field like I do any other field. So this is no different than creating a calculation that says first name and last name together equal full name, right? But all I'm doing is I'm saying a little HTML plus some JavaScript and then some more HTML equals this thing that I'm seeing in the web viewer. Kind of cool, right? And the other thing that's interesting about this is if I want to use that JavaScript for something else, like the demo I'm about to show next, actually uses the same JavaScript in several different places. But all I have to do is define it once. I just put it into one field, and all those different calculations reference that. Keep it really efficient that way. All right, let me get to that more practical demo. Oh, notes, page 2. All right. Okay, so let's talk about this in a form that kind of makes, you know, more practical sense. So here's a FileMaker database. And by the way, a FileMaker database that Matt Petrowski prettied up for me. Thank you, Matt Petrowski. And you should definitely go to his session because he's crazy with this stuff. Now, what this database does is it's a project management database. Okay, so it's got projects in it. It's got what do we call them again? Contributors, collaborators. Sounds so nefarious. Contributors and then tasks, and it's all related. One project has many contributors, and one contributor has many tasks, and so on. So what I've got in this port, in the context of a project. Here's all the tasks, and I can check off boxes to see whether or not they're complete. And here are the contributors down in the portal on the bottom, and I can see what % complete their tasks are, right? Makes sense. This is pretty basic stuff. But what I want to do is I want to make this layout a little bit more compelling. I want to make it so that just at a glance I can see exactly what % complete we are on a project, because at the end of the day, that's what a project management database system does, right? So what I want to do, and this is the technique that I've been telling you guys about. This is where I'm going to have you guys do the copying and pasting and build this kind of functionality into your databases without having to know anything about the JavaScript and CSS, okay? Deal? So let's start really simple. I'm going to do something where I want to add a progress bar. Okay, you know, a progress bar is like one of those things on the blood drive, like here's our goal and here's what % we are at the goal. Here, our goal on a project is 100% complete, right? Or maybe 110% complete would be also good. But we're just going to say 100% complete, and then I want to know what % complete all the tasks are. So what I do is I go out to the interwebs and I Google around. And I happen to find some examples. And this is a real website called rgraph.net. And you should check it out because it, like thousands of other resources on the web, have free, already created JavaScript and CSS for you. So I can go through all the examples and I look at it and I go, oh, okay, if I download the progress bar example files, I can make them look like any one of these 3 here. And they all have sort of APIs and instructions to make it look as cool as you want to. Well, in this case, I'm going to keep it real simple. I'm going to go with this one with like 100% and then whatever % complete. All right, so I go and I download this. And what does this look like? Don't be afraid, I promise. Here's what it looks like. So I get a couple of files that actually come with it. So this is to sort of speak to my point. This is an HTML5 chart, but really to make it all work, it needs a CSS file, 2 JavaScript files, and then this HTML. But we don't care about the JavaScript and the CSS. It doesn't matter. We're barely even going to look at it. What we care about, though, is the HTML, because if you think about what I was doing before, I was actually hand typing in HTML into a field, and then my field was pointing to that web viewer. Instead, what we're going to do is inside the web viewer's calculation, what I'm actually going to do is I need HTML to look like this. That's all I have to do is comply with this format of the data in order for this whole thing to work. And you guys, this is pretty easy stuff too. If you've ever done a calculation in FileMaker, for example, that's like the send email, and then you want to make the body sort of dynamic where you say like dear and then first name field and then a return character and here's all your orders and maybe a little list function and show all those. It's the same thing here. All I need to do is create a calculation that outputs this text. So a couple things to point out. Up here is where all the functionality is for this progress bar. That's the JavaScript files and the CSS files. And they are no joke. All right, so, but don't worry about it. We don't care. Remember? I promised you, you don't care. So instead, this technique that I'm going to propose to you guys today, which I'm really excited about, and I've been using it like crazy, is that what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my FileMaker file. Okay, just to give you an idea how this normally works on the web. Normally on the web, I would put these 4 files into a web directory, and I would point to the HTML file, and the HTML would reference the JavaScript, and it would do its thing. Okay? But in FileMaker, especially like I promised, when you're not connected to the web, we don't have a web directory to work with. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a table inside my FileMaker database. All right, let's take a look at that. I'm going to do a little Julia Childs thing for you guys in the interest of time. Put it in the oven and voila. So it's like a time machine. So what I did is I actually created another table. So here's all the tables that actually manage all the data. And this table, no records in it, is called resources. I just chose that as naming convention. All my demos will have resources in it. And what I did is I went in and I defined, let's just focus on these up here. I defined 3 global fields. And I will put those global fields on a layout, which I'll show you in a second. And I'm just going to paste the data into those. So this is going to be like my directory on the web server where all this data is stored. And because they're fields, I can create calculations that reference the contents of these fields. And why did I make them global? Well, I'm somewhat rhetorical. Well, and here's why. Because no matter what context I'm in and I want to talk to these JavaScript, if I want to use this progress bar in a bunch of different places in my database, I don't have to worry about creating relationships to a global field. Wherever I am in a FileMaker database, I can access a global field's contents. Okay, that's the trick here. So forget about all these. I got a whole bunch of other demos that I created, but just to show you, I have, we can do tons of stuff inside a FileMaker database, and we actually don't have any records here. So I created the table, and I'm creating a layout for this table now, okay? And I put all those 3 fields on there. And here's where the tricky part comes from. Really nervous about this. Everybody just shh. Copy. Paste. Whew. I've been worrying about that for like 2 months. Okay, so I just keep doing it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Remember that on your evaluations. All I'm doing is I'm just populating those fields. I don't have to worry about like referencing them in a calculation where I got to escape everything and do all the line breaks and all that crazy stuff. Copy, paste, forget it. And of course, because they're global fields, I just want to mention I'm doing this offline because once I upload it to the server, of course, the global fields will inherit whatever contents were in them when I uploaded them. So I do all this, and what's nice about the JavaScript and the CSS is that I don't even have to worry about it. The stuff that's going to manipulate this progress bar is coming from FileMaker, not these fields, not the JavaScript and CSS. I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so now we've addressed the JavaScript and the CSS. Now what I need to do is create, just back on this thing here, I need to create a calculation that outputs this, all right? So let's go into my database. Okay, and go into the table where I want to display this, which is the strangely called the events table. And here's my calculation. So let's spend a couple minutes here talking about this. Now I know what you're thinking. There's a lot of words up there. But most of them are just commented out lines so that you guys can see what's happening here. That's about a quarter of what's happening in this calculation. Is that, can you guys read that? Is that okay, clarity? You can see that? Okay, good. So what I've done, let's focus on the very top. Start at the top. These are just the tags that show up on the top of any HTML document. Really simple. Just put some text in quote. My data URL is the first line. And notice how I'm doing the ampersand, paragraph return, another ampersand. This is not necessary inside my HTML calculation. I don't need to have line breaks in there. But for my own sanity, I've put them in there. Because what I can do is use the data viewer, okay, to preview what the output of this calculation formula is going to be, and I can just copy the contents or the output of the data viewer, put it into a text editor and hold it side by side and see, all right, where did I go wrong? Here's the original HTML and here's the stuff that's output by my calculation. And I can go line by line by line and find out where my errors might be. Takes me a while, got a lot of errors, so anything I can do to help mitigate that situation, I take advantage of. So then we get down, this is it. This is the magic trick part. Then I have to go to the part where I reference the JavaScript. And here all I'm doing is just referencing, I'm doing something interesting here. I'm not referencing the field, the global field like I told you. I'm showing you another technique here. Instead what I'm doing is I'm referencing global variables. Because those fields have a lot of data in them, right? Like a pretty verbose amount of data. One technique you can do, and by the way, this technique is only really relevant when you're hosting a file in a multi-user environment. If you're doing something offline or single user or just on an iPad, you don't even really have to go through all these hoops. But what I'm doing on the startup of the file, let me just go back and show you what's happening here. On my startup script, I'm running a script that just is called set resources to application memory. So by going into the contents of those global fields in my resources table and setting them to a global variable, what I'm doing that is I'm moving the data into my local application memory, which means I don't have to keep going back to the server, let's say, or keep finding this data over the network. I'm just looking right there on my machine in the most optimal performance environment that I can. But again, it doesn't matter if you're just doing single user, right? So, but this is a technique. So everywhere you're going to see a reference to these field contents, what I'm actually doing is referencing the global variable. And the interesting thing is, those are session specific as well as relevant to just my local application environment. Okay. So then the rest of it is just more text, just a tag there. I'm going to get to that dynamic thing in a second. And then some of the formatting that I needed. I just needed an open script tag and some other stuff. But here's the other part that I wanted to show you. That is just a FileMaker calculation field. Okay? So let me go back to the HTML and show you. Sorry about the resize, and I know it's a little early. We'll get you some Dramamine. So inside this HTML, as I snooped around inside the HTML, and well, there's directions too, but directions. I've just determined that this line right here is what's really driving how the bar is drawn. So right inside those parentheses there, in this particular example of a chart, it says 100 is your maximum level, right? That's the height of the bar. And the number 89 is the percent complete, or that's where the color part of the bar is going to show up. So what I did in FileMaker, instead of hard coding that in, if I just hard coded all this in as raw text, then every single one of my progress bars would be 89 out of 100% complete, right? Very promising, especially at the beginning of a project, but not accurate. So instead what I've done, and this is where we start talking about integrating FileMaker data, is I went into the calculation and I created this calculation field. Pay no attention to this. This is just there for my own purposes so I know what format I need to match. But up here on the top, I just said, okay, all this stuff is just text. So I just put that in text. All right? And then I am concatenating it with a container or a calculation field that I already had in my database that just does some simple, what are the total tasks, how many of them are complete, divide them and round them and all that kind of stuff, right? And again, this is where we get back to the fact that the web viewer is an unstored calculation, essentially, because as people are checking off the tasks, this HTML is going to update, and that thing's going to rise and fall based on how complete we are with this. Hopefully it doesn't fall. That would seem odd. And that's inside this calculation. All right, so that's this field right here. And the rest is just all the other text that it needs. So then what I do, now that I've got that calculation, I go into my layout and I drop a web viewer in there and I simply point the web viewer to that calc field. All right, so let's take a look at what this thing looks like. So now in browse mode, first of all, check this out. It's resizing. I'll get to that in a second. But I've got this simple little progress bar. But look what happens when me or other users of this system change the status of different tasks. You see that moving? It's actually probably going the wrong direction for project management. Let's actually go back up. Here we go. Now we're cooking with gas. Pretty cool, right? Oh, hey, nice. Oh, you just wait. So what the fun part about this is when you put this up on a server and other users are actually doing the checking and you're just sitting there watching it happen. Or you could be on your iPad that's connected to the server and watch all this stuff update. Pretty sweet, right? So let's take this a step further. All right. I've got a lot of tasks and I've got these contributors, and the contributors are all like a certain % complete, and they all have start dates and end dates at different times. What might be an interesting way to display that on screen? Just like, what was that? Just like in rehearsal. Thank you, Carlo. A Gantt chart. But we can't build Gantt charts in FileMaker, can we? What number are Gantt charts on the wish list of FileMaker, Rick? 2 or 3? Okay, 20, he said. Okay, so now I have a Gantt chart right inside my FileMaker database, right? So how did I do this? Well, I went out to the webs, the interwebs, did a little Googling. I happened to land on the same website. This rgraph.net has all sorts of great resources. And I found out that they have free Gantt chart stuff. Sounds like it's complicated. So I like this one right here. So what I do is I go and I download. And this is what the Gantt chart looks like. Okay. So a bunch of CSS, JavaScript, we don't care about that anymore, right? Well, surprisingly, the HTML that I have to create in my calculation isn't that big of a deal, right? This is pretty easy stuff. So I'm looking for, I see already here, based on this technique, I can go and define a cascading style sheet and all the JavaScript, whatever. We already addressed that. But here's 2 places I want you to take a look at. First of all, in HTML5, there's this canvas tag. And what this one is doing is it's actually determining what the fixed width and height of my chart is going to be. And you notice that there's numbers in here, 800 by 350. But I don't know if you noticed, my favorite part of this is when I resize this non-vector based graph, it completely adjusts to the width of my screen, right? Well, how's that happening if it's a fixed width? Well, I'll show you that in a second. The other thing that I wanted to show you is this is that data. These are data arrays, right? These are just lists. An array is just a list. And this is all the data that this Gantt chart needs to interpret to turn into all those different bars that we see on screen. Now, every one of these little bracketed things is just one of the contributors on the project formatted in that way. We can do that in a calculation, right? So let's go into my calculation dialogues, or let's go into the file and check these out. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the contributor level, and I've got this calculation here. Because remember, every contributor needs to be formatted in a certain way. So here's my calculation. It's not that crazy. I left the sample stuff down here. Open bracket. There's an open bracket. That first number, because I read the directions, is the start day of the year, like the day of year for the first task that they have of all their tasks. The next one is the total duration of all the tasks that they have. So if they start on January 1st, that would be a 1. And if they have 15 days worth of tasks, the next one's a 15, right? Then I round the % complete. I just simply do a calculation elsewhere here that says, well, they have 5 tasks or 10 tasks, and let me keep this math simple. 5 tasks or 10 tasks, 5 of them are done, 50% complete, right? Is that good? Did I get that? Then I just take their name, and I have to format the name with a single quote, so I just do a little calc stuff with it. Pretty simple, right? It's not that tough. Now, because I need to show that in a list, I go back to the table that happens to be a parent to this one. And inside my calculation, this is all stuff that we looked at before, but what I do, oh, I'm sorry, wrong calc, is here it is. This is what I actually have to have in the HTML is this. So what I did is I just did this calculation. This is all text, pretty easy. And instead, I used a list function to give me all the related contributors, but I pointed to that field I just created. So essentially, it's creating an array of all those bracketed numbers and whatnots. And it does, and because it's a relationship and it's a calculation, if I add another contributor to the project or any of those values change, my Gantt chart instantly updates. And then I had to substitute out the return characters with actual commas because that's what the HTML required. So then I referenced that calculation. So you see, I mean, I'm kind of blowing through the calculation part because you guys are smart. You already know FileMaker calculations. That's the other room over there where the calculation discussion is going. So what I'm just showing you is I can just do all that stuff in FileMaker. I don't have to think about HTML or JavaScript or CSS. I just use my own skill sets in FileMaker to do all that. And there's some other ones here too. The other cool thing about this chart is that it automatically knows which months to show based on what tasks there are that are related to this project. So I just use like a execute SQL thing to find all the distinct months from another list function, and I just list them in a certain order, right? And that's what these calcs are. Oh, that's the label calc, and then these are the maximum, the very first start day of any related task. I get that integer through that calculation. It's just a bunch of FileMaker stuff, right? I don't want to weigh you down with stuff you already know. And what that's doing is creating this Gantt chart. And just to show you, I have no tricks up my. If I change the start date from well, first, see how it's, oh, all right. Sorry, that was a trick up my sleeve. So see how the start date is July? Well, what if I go into the actual tasks and I say, make this June instead? Do you see? Sorry. Sorry about that. So do you see how it added June automatically? Added June automatically, and it added the new start date. So it's constantly updating. Just like my progress bar is updating, my Gantt chart can constantly update. Now let's get to that wacky thing that I was showing you. Oh, no, wait. Two more things. So that's fun, right? Gantt charts are fun. Here's another one that I found. This one happens to be, I found this on the web on a really good resource that's called jQueryui.com. I found this cool thing that's called Accordion that has these collapsible lists of things, and it kind of reminded me of a sub-summary report. So I said, what the heck, I'm going to build. Well, then I looked at the source, and I thought, oh, I can do this. So I downloaded all the free code, and I built it into this web viewer that you see here. And what this lets me do is have my users interact with this in a collapsible sub-summary that doesn't require users to scroll. It's just a fixed area, and I can kind of interact with it. It's just sort of being fancy. And one last thing I want to show you integrated into this file. I got a lot of dates for this project, and I kind of want to have a more visual way that I can look at all the dates and see what months they land on, or weeks they land on, or days they land on. What might be an interesting way to look at these dates inside of the layout? Excellent. You weren't even here at rehearsal. How about a calendar? So this is a totally free, fully dynamic calendar that when you have tasks on a certain date, it pops up a cool little Java rollover, and it gives you some visibility as to how busy. Oh, October, I am totally taking a vacation, apparently. So a fully interactive calendar, license-free. Everything that's driven by this are all calculations. Very lightweight stuff to produce. Oh, that's my dog. He wanted me to get to this part again, just like we did in rehearsal. So the best part about everything I just showed you is I can do all of this on one of these crazy iPad things that all the kids have these days. And I can do it when I'm offline and not even connected to the internet. Pretty sweet, right? So here it is, interacting with it, collapsible sub-summary reports, all sorts of fun stuff right on the iPad device. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me pretend. Right on the iPad device, right? Pretty cool. So just to step back for a second. Ooh, notes, page 4. Okay, so what we're really talking about doing here is FileMaker Web Viewers can interpret HTML. FileMaker calculations can create HTML. Okay? We can even pass data into the web viewers by just referencing other calculations. All right? So all that's kind of within our range. And all this, like, there's the main concept behind all this are data arrays, okay? I know you probably can't read this too much, but it's just sort of there for a visual. The idea here is that I look inside the HTML for all those arrays of data, and then what I do is I create calculations that will output that HTML. So it's all FileMaker stuff here, right? Now I see a couple of you trying to take pictures of the screen. I promise you my slides that you can actually read will be, or are currently on the conference website, so all this information will be on there. In addition, you can go on that FileMaker HTML5.com and get this information. But what the heck? How about if I just give you a copy of this project management file with all my code and everything in there? What do you guys think? No way, absolutely not. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I worked really hard on this file knowing that I was going to give it to you guys. I'm excited to share. If you go at the end of my session, I have it perfectly timed, so don't go there yet. But if you go to FileMakerHTML5.com, you can download a wide open copy of this project management file. Got all my calculations in it. There's also a link for all the JavaScript and CSS resource files that I used, and even a copy of my slides on there. All I ask you to do is leave me a comment and let me know what you think about this stuff. So that'll be at the end of this session. So pretty cool. We happy about that? All right. Okay, so just to review what's going on here. Here's how we approach this. We imagine cool stuff. That's not on here, but we imagine cool stuff we want to do inside our FileMaker database. And then we go out into the interwebs and, okay, it's the internet. I'm starting to sound like I really think that's the name. We go on and we Google and we find out, okay, where are some, literally thousands and thousands of free resources out there. I only showed you 2 websites, but there are literally thousands of them. Go somewhere that says, okay, well, here's a Gantt chart, or here's cool drag and drop, or here's weird, interesting, sortable stuff, or collapsible things, or moving, spinning logos and flames, or whatever you want, and find it. Download it, and then you look at those files that I showed you before, and you've got an HTML file, and you've got the JavaScript and the CSS. And for all the JavaScript and CSS, we just go build a resources table, right, and define a field, and then just paste that information in there. Then the real work that we're doing, we really burn some calories by going in and creating a calculation field that outputs that same HTML format that we want. Which really, I mean, it really isn't that complicated. You can see that whole Gantt chart, which is pretty sophisticated, really only had this much HTML, right? Then we can take that, if we're doing multi-user, we can do the script that sets the global variables to the contents upon open and just use application memory. Or then what we do is we go and put a web viewer on a layout, and then we reference that calculation that's outputting the HTML. Okay, so more demos? How about I show you some cool examples of this stuff? Yeah, now we're talking. The caffeine is starting to kick in. Okay, so let me show you, I'll take you on a little tour here, get rid of all this yucky code. And, okay, the first one I'm going to show you is a proof of concept piece that we created for a client to show another client. And the objective of this database, just to give you an idea of some real world applications here, is the database is intended to store product information. And then the thing that you see on the right-hand side is a preview of what a catalog page is going to look like. Okay, so what they wanted to be able to do inside the FileMaker database is be able to pick certain images. They go into this portal here and check off certain images, and then those images will appear. I already showed you how that works, right? So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, why would I want an image to show up in HTML? Well, here's an example. And then they want different things, like they got these are called callouts, and they want these little buttons to show up, and they want to, what the objective here is that they want to be able to move the images around like with pixel precision and lock them into place, and then save the XY coordinates of the location of the images and the image IDs to another table somewhere. And then take those callouts and move them into a very precise location, create records on their locations and save it. And then what they do is they output that data and do some sort of transformation into InDesign, for example. So what the users really want to be able to do is interact with the layout and be able to move things around on screen. So let's take a look at how that might work. So you notice down here I got these little callouts. I'm going to pick one of them. Check that out. It's attached to my cursor. I'm going to put it right there, and a script runs that confirms with me the location of that and what image it's over. And then over here you see that I'm actually creating a record in the database when that happens. So very subtle, and every time I move it, it creates a history of all these movements until finally I'm done and I can lock this out and move on. So very subtle use of this technology Users might not even know that you can't move things around in FileMaker layouts, but we can build this so that you can. And in here, I'm literally using the same code that I showed you earlier where I was moving the guy around onto the chair. And it just runs a script. So just to show you, oh, wrong one. Okay, here we go. So I move this around, and it runs that script, right? And the script goes and passes a bunch of data back to the database, and then the script parses it out. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this is instead of using the URLs, when you check one of the product images, what's actually happening is an alternative method to being able to integrate images into your web viewer. So I want to pause for a moment and talk to you about this. So I already showed you this example of here's where you put the image into the container and it shows up in the web viewer. And I'm using a little calculation to compose the URL. There's another way you can do this too. This is an image in a container field, and this little button here is a Apple script that someone created for me because I have to figure out a way to do this outside of FileMaker. I hit that button, and what it did is it just turned that image into a big block of text. So what's the point of that? The point is now I don't have to even be connected to the FileMaker server here. I can use a different syntax. This might look kind of familiar to you. See, here's that img src equals. So instead of that big long string, what I did is I'm using something very similar. It's a data URL, but it's for the purposes of looking at something that's called base64 code. So what I just did is I turned that image into base64 code. It's an encoding scheme. Sounds kind of crazy. It's an encoding scheme that's intended to represent binary data in an ASCII format. In English, Chris? Okay, yes, that just means turn an image into a big block of text. And so what I can do with this, which is kind of compelling, is, by the way, in that calendar I showed you, when you do the hover over a date and the thing pops up, there's actually an image in the background that's doing a gradient. But in order for you guys to be able to use this offline, I can't point to a web server to point to that image. So instead what I did is I turned the image into base64 text and just hard-coded or embedded in to the HTML this big block of text. So this base64 concept is a way that I can also use images, but I can do it when I'm offline. Also, I could, instead of saving it to a field and taking on all that additional data storage burden, I could instead run a script that just saves that to application memory instead, and then reference the application memory in the web viewer. So anyways, kind of an interesting little sidetrack thing there for you. That's base64 encoding here. That information will be on the slides. Okay, so let's kind of up the ante a little bit here with some of these demos. What do you say about that? So, okay, next one. Here's another one we built for a client that this one does require that you're online, but what they gave us was a database that just contains a bunch of customer records in it, right? And also inside that database is they used a certain API to actually go and grab latitude and longitude. And by the way, they're inside FileMaker, you can actually grab location information through calculations if you're using a device. So this could be a way that you gather the information, and then we want a way to display it. So in this particular case, what we wanted to do, see this value here, this amount value, this is their total number in sales that client had for the current year. So what they wanted us to do is plot all their customers on a map, and in every sort of cluster of customers, like in a metropolitan area, show the total number of sales for that region. That's pretty kind of cool, right? You can just see, where am I getting all the money from in this particular whatever it is, quarter or whatever it is. So instead of building an entire map, what we ended up doing here is we use the Google Map API. So this does require that you're connected to the web because you have to confirm that your API is active and all that kind of good stuff. But what it does is it plots all these customer records on a map, which is super sweet, and it totals up all that FileMaker data. But the cool thing is when I click on one of those clusters, I'm actually passing an array of data. That's the IDs of all the customers that are in view right now. So you see as I drill down further, that little list of customer IDs shrinks. I'm passing that through a script variable back to the database and unpackaging it as a script and putting it into a field that I use in a relationship. So I don't know if you know that, but if you do a return to limited list of IDs on the parent side of a relationship, the child side will show all the related records to all of those IDs in the array. So the trick there is that As I keep drilling down, that array gets smaller and smaller, and I'm able to use the relationship there for things like the portal that you see and even the go to related records that pop that window up. Kind of cool, right? That one's sort of interesting. Oh. Josh did that one in the front row here, so thank you, Josh. That's beautiful stuff. Now, here's what's actually going on with this database, just to kind of show you, because I want to introduce you to something else. Here's my resources table, essentially. We have to point to the Google API, so I put that there. Here's the JavaScript. Josh only had to modify this just a little bit so that it ran the FMP URL. So on the drill down, we just added another action to what the Google API was already doing. We said, run an FMP URL while you're at it. And then in addition, made some brief changes here so that the pop-up that you clicked on when you hit the pinpoint actually shows FileMaker data. But over here is where I wanted to point your attention. This is what the outputted HTML looks like. And those little lines that you see there with the little squigglies and whatnot, that's what the Google API required us to do. We had to format each customer record in that format. And that's not just an arbitrary format either. What you're actually looking there, well, here's the format up here. Here's the legend. It's actually really easy to read. We looked at those other data arrays earlier where it's like div tags and lines and all sorts of crazy stuff going on. Well, this one's a little bit easier to read because this is what's called JSON. Okay, this is JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a lightweight data interchange format that we love because it's easy to read as human beings, and therefore it's just as easy for applications to read and parse. So if you look at it, it's very human readable, and there's some really interesting things going on inside this formatting that work particularly well for us database developers. So here on screen, what I'm actually looking at is a JSON formatted representation of a record in a FileMaker database. All right? So what you see in the white are fields, and what you see in the blue are the data. So it's like a field label and then the data inside the field. But what's really interesting, you see where it says data and then there's a little squiggly? That's actually parent information. So in our FileMaker language, what that is that's a way that we can represent information about, in this case, this is the greatest player in the National Football League, and he happens to be a member of the greatest team of all times. And so I put the parent information in there, and that tells me, okay, Aaron Rodgers is a member of the Packers. God bless. Thank you. But the really cool thing is that little children thing down there. You see the children thing? There's open brackets. I don't have anything in there right now because in this particular use, the player table, so it's a team table with related players, I don't have anything below the players yet, right? I could put stats there or something like that if I wanted to. But here's an example of me using that. Inside the children bracket, that serves as like a portal. So all in one little chunk of JSON data, I can see information about the local record that I'm on, parent record information about that, and then also child information. I'm just using list functions to kind of write that out in the same manner I did that before. And don't worry, all this information's in the slides as well. And up on the FileMaker HTML5.com, I really break this down. So now, what's interesting about this particular set of data I used for an example here is I used football teams. And I nested their relationship with the teams that they're on, right? So that brings me to my favorite demo of the day. But first, I'm going to bring it down a notch, folks. I have an admission for you here. I'm an addict. My name's Chris, and I'm addicted to football. Much to the chagrin of my lovely fiancée, still on her cell phone. By the way, I spend about 20 hours a week on football. Sorry to my clients, guys. You know the drill. And what I did is I created this database that manages all the teams in the NFL and all the players and all their stats, and it's just ridiculous. And I probably spent about 1,000 hours on this. It's really sad. But let me show you a couple of things that I do. One of the things I have to do is update the data all the time. One of the things that happens is that rosters change, especially now, and we're in training camp, right? Like people get injured, and then someone else goes and takes their place. And okay, let me just calm down for a second. Okay, let's find a good team. Okay, there we go. So what I'm doing in this case is I have a portal. This is the team, and then I have a portal where I go in, and for those not familiar with the game of football, you have a first string guy and a second string guy and a third string guy, and that's the order of importance essentially for them on the team. So what I want to do is be able to change, Aaron Rodgers is the #1 quarterback, but God forbid Vince Young is the starter at some point. Oh my Lord. So what I did is I created, how are my edges there? You guessed it. A web viewer on this layout so that I can more easily interact with this information. So for example, let's say Vince Young becomes the starting quarterback. Watch what happens over here when I change Aaron Rodgers back. Yes. I know that was for me putting Aaron Rodgers back instead of Vince Young, but it's pretty cool what's happening there too. So it doesn't have to be crazy, scream in your face stuff that you're doing here. It can be very subtle. And frankly, again, your users don't know FileMaker can't do this already. Now it can, right? So all I did in this case is I went to jQuery UI and I found something that's called sortable. And then I was thinking, one of my clients is the USC Trojans football team, and they have actually, this is called the depth chart in football world, their sports world. And they have these big magnetic boards where they move these names around and slide them around. They call it the depth chart. So I went to them and I go, hey, I just thought of this great idea. I can do this on the iPad for you, right? So I did it for myself first, naturally. So that's a very subtle way to put some really cool functionality into your database. Now this is actually the part that I'm super excited about. Okay, so remember I showed you the JSON stuff where it was like, here's a record and he's part of this team and then this team has all these players. Well, I'm organizing all my data on the back end. Every record that I have in this database is represented as that JSON format in the background. So I was thinking about one of my biggest burdens is that I have to look at all these players, right? All the players in the whole league. And I wanted to be able to put all the players in the National Football League all on one screen at the same time and be able to play around with them and manipulate them around. So I could be sitting in front of my TV on a Sunday, glorious Sunday, and watching it and go, wow, who's that guy on the whatever team? And, or gosh, who's the wide receiver for the Chargers now that everybody's injured? Let me go drill down and find that team and da-da-da-da. So I created my piece de resistance, which I call the team tree. So here's one way I could look at it. All this raw data in a spreadsheet format, blah. But instead what I did is I created a layout and I thought of an interesting way that I could represent all this data on screen at one time, and I call this glorious thing the team tree. And what I did is I added some, this is all JSON, you can kind of get how the relationships work here, but what's neat is the animation that I provided. This becomes a navigation tool now, where I can move around all over the players and the teams and pick different people. So this essentially is one big huge portal to all the players and a navigation element all at the same time and some kind of fun factor. Now this same kind of thing could be applied to an organization chart or anything that has some sort of logical relationships to it. And so what else is cool is you see up in the upper right hand corner where I've got those little check boxes. All I'm doing there, oh by the way, what happens when you click on the player name is it runs an FMP URL that brings up this layout here of just ridiculousness. But up in the upper right hand corner what you see is a little checkbox, and all I'm doing there is the same. So if this is a portal and it's all the player data, I'm just doing that same concept of filtering a portal through some global fields. Oh, and by the way, this works on the iPad as well. Not connected to the web. All the information is totally localized, and I can play around with it. So in this one you see I have more of those checkboxes. So here all I'm doing is I'm changing the criteria of my relationship to say, we don't need to look at tight ends or running backs. Let's just look at quarterbacks and wide receivers. And you see that it filters. And then I can say, then I can drill down into it or pick certain players or whatnot. And even that little G and the B there on the bottom, for whatever strange purposes, I'm determining which players might have a really good or bad matchup for that week for my own entertainment, frankly. So this is kind of a fun way to go out and do this, but all I did is I was Googling around and just sort of thinking about stuff, and I ran across some free library of stuff that was doing something similar. I pulled it down, parsed it all out, built it into my database, and threw it on a web viewer, and this is what I ended up with, which I'm pretty excited about, actually. Oh, yay. Yeah, thank you very much. Now, I've got one more demo that I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to wrap up some tips. And anybody who's got questions, I want to let Todd Geist set up in here. So I'll be happy to answer questions and talk to you guys forever over on the side. But one more demo here. This is actually a real-world demo that we built for one of our clients. And what they do, they built this database and they provided it to us. And this is for managing guests at a fundraiser. The best way I can think of this is, imagine this is guests for a wedding, let's say, right? You got to figure out what table everybody's sitting at, manage all the RSVPs, set up the room, and all that kind of stuff. So they do this for fundraisers, but imagine it's for a wedding. So here is a FileMaker layout, no lie, that you're about to see in a second, that allows them to pull up all the individuals that have been marked RSVP yes for this event. Let's say it's a wedding. Put them into different tables. We can employ different rules, like no one from the bride side mixes with the groom side if we needed to, that kind of thing. Oh, now my fiance's paying attention. Interesting. And we can drag and drop people around, and we can apply filters and say everybody with food allergies sits at one table outside, like those kind of things. And what's cool about it, all it's doing is it's just FMP, sending around instructions. Okay, go edit this record and say what table and seat these people are at, or go move. When we're drawing. Oh, by the way, we can set up the rooms too. That's the biggest part of this. It's not just an image in the background. You actually set up the room. You build this code. You create records in the background for where all the tables are located, how many chairs they have, which table style, all that kind of stuff. And what's cool about it is you can save the entire room configuration for your next wedding, if you want to. I'm sorry, for your next fundraiser event. So what this is just a vehicle for users to be able to interact with the FileMaker data and create and edit and embellish FileMaker data right inside a Web Viewer. And by the way, yes, this one works on the iPad as well. Pretty sweet, right? All right, so real quick, I'm going to wrap this up in about a minute. What I want you, actually, these are just some tips. These are various different things, like the global field thing I was telling you about. Go ahead and download these. I'll show you how you wrap the JavaScript and the CSS. One thing I want to point out in the middle, I called this a weird bug. I'm sorry, Rick, I didn't have a chance to change my slides since last night. But that if you put a Web Viewer on a layout in FileMaker Go, it puts a little refresh button on it, which could kind of screw up your chart. The way to fix that now is you just name the object and go to the object, and it gets rid of that. But we saw last night that that's no longer a worry. Thank you for that. And then the global variable thing, the base 64. Remember when executing scripts and all that kind of good stuff. So, okay. Oh, God, I'm so glad to be done. I'm sorry, did I say that out loud? Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up real quick. Please go to FileMakerHTML5.com and download your very own copy of the project management database. It's up there right now. And also, don't forget, this is really important, for all of you that enjoyed the session, go to the evaluation link and tell us all about it and rate this. And do that all week long. And this really helps us out and gives us some good feedback. So most importantly, you guys, thank you so much for coming. I had a really good time today. Have a good DevCon.